So, without further ado, I'll pass the mic over to Jimmy Aiken.
Let's see how this mic goes. Okay, that's pretty good. So, first thing, howdy, folks.
Howdy.
Good to see y'all. Very glad to be back here in my hometown of Fayetteville, Arkansas. Tonight we're going to be talking about the mysteries of Christmas, because there's a lot of stuff we don't know about Christmas, but we can find out the answers to some of the things. Before we do that, though, got a couple of disclaimers for you. The first one is what we're going to be trying to do tonight is solve mysteries by the use of human reason. Therefore, the answers that I'm going to propose are not matters of church teaching. So feel free to disagree. It won't bug me. These are just the proposals that seem reasonable to me based on what we can figure out from the historical evidence. But if you have other opinions, that's totally fine. So, what's wrong with this picture? Well, if you think about it, there are a number of things that are wrong with it. Some things are more obvious than others. Some you got to look a little bit closer. There are at least 4 things that are wrong with this picture as a depiction of the night Christ was born. Anyone want to guess at what some of those 4 reasons are? You, sir. The 3 wise men are there, but they should not have arrived yet. That's correct. They didn't arrive until up to 2 years after the night Jesus was born. Anyone else see something? You, sir.
He's not in a stable.
We'll get to that. Anybody else?
No shepherds.
Well, actually, there is a shepherd. He's there over on the left holding a lamb. But you're right. There could be more shepherds than there are. You, ma'am? There's a pig. I think it's a sheep, but you would be right. There should not be a pig. I'll tell you what I got out of this. Oh, you sir, little fella? Not able to fully hear you. Something about the angel?
Right next to the angel is someone holding something. Looks like a camel.
Yeah, there is a camel next to the angel. But camels could have accompanied the wise men because they had a big trek over the desert to come from the east, and camels are very good transport to bring with you in the desert. Here are the things that I would mention. First of all, there's an angel there. And if you read the Gospels, it's in the middle. It's got the Gloria banner. If you read the Gospels, none of them say that there is an angel there the night Jesus was born, not where he was born. Also, if you look closely, the 3 magi in this illustration of this nativity scene, they're depicted as kings. You can tell because they're wearing crowns. And even though there's that famous hymn or Christmas song, We Three Kings, they actually, magi are not kings. They're something completely different, which we'll get to. Also, the 3 magi are multiracial. They look like one of them comes from Europe, and one of them comes from Asia, and one of them comes from Africa, and that's not what you would have seen. Now, it can be a nice symbol of the unity of humanity in falling under Christ's saving rule as our Messiah, because it doesn't matter what race you are, we're all fellow Christians, we all belong to Jesus Christ, the whole of mankind belongs to Jesus Christ. So it can be a nice symbol, but it's not what you would have seen, because as we'll see, the wise men came from the east, so they would have looked like Middle Easterners. But the big thing, this young fellow over here pointed out already, the wise men are there. And the wise men should not be there on the night Jesus was born, because they actually came up to 2 years later, which we'll see in a little bit. What's wrong with this picture? Well, there are a few things we've already covered. we've got the three wise men there on the night Jesus was born, and they're once again depicted as kings. I could cite several things here, but there's one prominent one that I'm thinking of. Anyone want to take a guess at something really large in the picture? And it's not the star. It's not the star. It's the barn. Yes. Jesus is being depicted as being born in a barn. And there's very good reason to think that that was not the case, which we'll get to. So, and there's just three things. So, Christmas art, like nativity scenes or Christmas cards or things like that, it's not really historically accurate. And that's okay. It's devotional in nature. It's meant to help us grow closer to God and to appreciate what He did for us. And what it tends to do is it compresses together things that actually occurred in different places and on different occasions, but they're all related to Jesus' birth. And so art tends to just smush them all together to give us an impression of Jesus' birth. And there's nothing wrong with that. So I don't want to give you the idea that we should be super nitpicky. Does this parish have a manger scene? Yeah. Okay, don't nitpick that. It's okay. I'm just pointing out that if you're interested in the history that's behind the images that we see in art, which are devotional images and are perfectly healthy and good in and of themselves, you want to just realize that it's like when you're watching a TV show or a movie about a historical event. It's not meant to be 100% accurate. It's meant to give you an impression. So, let's try to figure out what we can about what really happened. And let's start with a very common question. What day was Jesus born? This is a common question. Of course, the church celebrates it, Christ's birth, on December 25th. But the church does not teach that Christ was born on December 25th. This is not a matter of doctrine. It is a matter of history. And so, if we want to figure out on what day was he born, regardless of the day we celebrate it, we need to look at historical evidence. So what historical evidence do we have? Well, there are two prominent arguments for why he would not have been born on December 25th. One of them is that Luke says the shepherds were out in the fields by night on the night he was born, and if that was December 25th, it was too cold for that to happen. It was too cold to have sheep out in the fields. They should have been confined somewhere it was warm, like a nice big warm barn with central heating that didn't exist in the first century. And so that's one argument, a prominent argument. Jesus couldn't have been born on December 25th because it's just too cold for sheep. The other one is that the date, December 25th, was lifted from a pagan holiday. Like there was this big pagan holiday in December, and the Christians couldn't really compete with it directly, so they said, let's have our own celebration on this day, so all of our new converts won't go celebrate that massive pagan thing, and we'll have a wholesome Christian alternative for them to celebrate. Okay, so those are two arguments why it couldn't be December 25th. Let's see how well they fared. When it gets cold, we humans tend to put on a certain garment. And I see many people in the room are actually wearing this garment, just like the gentleman in the photograph. What do we call that garment? A sweater. By any chance, does anyone happen to know what sweaters are made out of? Wool, yeah. Anyone know where wool comes from? Well, yeah, it turns out, this may come as a shock to some of y'all, but sheep are literally covered in that stuff. They're where we get the wool. And if you look at how thick their wool grows in the winter, they're like wearing multiple sweaters. And so sheep have no problem being out in the cold, in the snow. In fact, they weren't always domesticated. They're one of the older domesticated species, not as old as dogs, but older than many. But before they were domesticated, No one would put them in a barn in the winter. Their species grew up surviving in the winter just fine. That's why they grew the wool. And that's why their wool grows out thick in the winter. But you may not want to take my word for that. So let's Google winter sheep care and see what we find out about from experts about winter sheep care. Well, here's some tips, 11 important pointers when caring for sheep in winter by Rebecca Pierce, who is a shepherd. She's a sheep expert. And on the question, can sheep tolerate cold weather? She says, sheep are some of the hardiest animals you can raise in cold weather. Take it from me, where I live, winter temperatures regularly dip into the sub-zero territory. It's not uncommon to have a stretch of cold weather in which temperatures range between minus 20 to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, often with a wind chill. Although it doesn't usually stay this cold all winter, it's cold enough to say the least. Our sheep barely bat an eye. In fact, the first year we raised our small flock of 5 sheep, we had a hard time convincing them to go inside the barn when it was that cold. Most of the time, they preferred to stay outside, even when it was sleeting or snowing. So, sheep don't really care. They're like honey badgers. They don't care about it being cold. And as far as those important points, the 11 of them, her number 2 tip is don't lock them up all day. I've said it once, but I'll say it again. Don't lock your sheep up all day. Not only will they go stir crazy, but you'll go stir crazy too. After all, that's a lot more poop you're going to have to shovel. So, pro tips from a pro. Don't keep your sheep locked up all day, even when it's cold. Now, anybody know, so Jesus was born where, right? Bethlehem. And that's up in northern Europe. It's in Scandinavia. It's in Sweden, right? Where they have really cold winters. Yeah. No, it's actually not. It's in the Middle East. So how cold does it really get in December? Well, if you search that, daily low temperatures in Bethlehem decreased by 5 degrees Fahrenheit from where they were in November. They range from 47 degrees at the beginning of the month on average, this is the average daily low, to 42 degrees at the end of the month, rarely falling below 37 or exceeding 54 degrees. So guess what? You walk out right now, it's colder here in Fayetteville than it ever gets in Bethlehem, on average, as a daily low. And, it's not too cold for us to be outside with a little protection. It never gets, on average, below the 40s in Bethlehem. Even at the end of December, it's still in the 40s for the daily low. So, do you think sheep can handle the 40s? Yeah, they probably can, and a lot harsher than that. But here's a little extra confirmation from a biblical scholar. Now, there's a book. It's an excellent book. I'm a huge fan of what's known as biblical chronology, which is the study of figuring out when things happen in the Bible. I love it. It's a great detective story. And one really good book on biblical chronology is Jack Finnegan's Handbook of Biblical Chronology. And of course, one of the things he treats is, when could Jesus have been born? Well, on that subject, he writes, as to objection that a wintertime date, on the supposition that the shepherds would not have been at that time out in the field keeping watch over their flock by night, William Hendrickson, he's a famous biblical scholar, William Hendrickson quotes a letter dated January 16, 1967, received from the New Testament scholar Harry Mulder, then teaching in Beirut in Lebanon, in which the latter, Harry Mulder, tells of being in Shepherd Field at Bethlehem on the just past Christmas Eve. Okay, so this guy's an eyewitness. Harry Mulder, don't know if he had a colleague named Scully, But Harry Mulder was in Shepherd's Field at Bethlehem on Christmas Eve, and what did he see? He says, right near us, a few flocks of sheep were nestling. Even the lambs were not lacking. It is therefore definitely not impossible that the Lord Jesus was born in December. So, anyone wants to tell you Jesus couldn't have been born December 25th because of sheep? Now you know a whole bunch more things about sheep you might never have thought of that you can use to rebut that. But what about that other popular argument that Christmas is based on a pagan holiday? Well, my first thought is, well, even if it is, what's wrong with that? Who cares? I'm a Christian. Subverting a pagan holiday is a good thing. So if there was a big Roman festival in December that everyone wanted to be part of, by all means, let's create a Christian alternative that's wholesome and oriented to the true God instead of whatever weird pagan god they're celebrating. But, so I would say it'd be a good thing. But, did it actually happen? Well, if it happened, we need to name the pagan holiday that was being subverted. It had to be some major pagan holiday for Christians to want to subvert it, because if it wasn't major, then Christians wouldn't have been tempted to participate. You know, it's kind of like, even today, non-Christians often celebrate Christmas just because of how powerful Christmas is in our culture. You know, and our Jewish friends, they may not have a Christmas tree, they may have a Hanukkah bush. But it's, you know, essentially borrowed from the Christmas tree. And so, it could be there was some major pagan festival in December that everyone was tempted to participate in, regardless of the religion. And so, Christians came up with an alternative that was wholesome. Well, what holiday would that have been? You often hear it's Saturnalia, or at least you used to hear this a lot. Saturnalia was a festival of the god Saturn, and it did occur in December, and it was kind of like April Fool's Day. People got to dress up strange, they got to play pranks on each other, the slaves got to act like masters, the masters acted like slaves, so they reversed roles. People would tell jokes and they'd shout, "Yo, Saturnalia!" It was their thing. But here's the deal. Saturnalia occurred too early to be where we got the date for Christmas from, because it was celebrated from December 17th to December 23rd. It was over before Christians were celebrating Christmas. So obviously, we didn't swipe the date of Saturnalia. Well, what about, on the other hand, the feast of Sol Invictus, the birthday of the unconquerable sun? Here we've got at least a little bit of argument you can make here, because that was December 25th. It was also the winter solstice, where the days start getting longer. And so the Romans celebrated the birth of the unconquerable sun on what they regarded as the winter solstice. Okay, so it's got the right date on the calendar for us to swipe the date of Christmas from it. But it's documented in the wrong year. The very first documentation we have of the celebration of Sol Invictus is in the Christian age. It's in a Christian document. The document is known as the chronology of the year 354. And in the chronology, it mentions that that Sol Invictus is being celebrated. Actually, it just says Invictus, maybe the unconquerable Christ. But going with the idea of Sol Invictus, we can't document it in pre-Christian times. For all we know, Romans picked it up from Christians. They wanted to celebrate their thing on our day. Or more likely, they just wanted to celebrate it on the winter solstice. But we can't document it prior to the time of Christ, which means we have no evidence that Christians swiped it from that. And furthermore, Sol Invictus was not a major sun festival. They did have major sun festivals in Rome, but they occurred at other times of the year. Sol Invictus was very minor. which is why it's not even mentioned in the historical record until Christian times. If it had been a big, huge, dominant thing like our Christmas, it would have been mentioned in the historical record earlier. But it's not. It's a very late holiday that was not a major one, and therefore Christians would have had no reason to copy its date, because nobody who wasn't already a pagan was tempted to celebrate it. It wasn't even a big deal for the pagans. So, if we want to figure out when Jesus was born, we want to look at other sources, and one of them is the Church Fathers. So, what do the early Christians say about when Jesus was born? Well, those who advocate the idea that Jesus was born on December 25th, when you read what they say about December 25th, they don't say, okay guys, let's subvert this pagan holiday. You don't see them plotting that. Instead, they say, okay, on this day we celebrate Christ's birth because that's when he was born. So the ones who advocate December 25th advocate it because that's the day they think Jesus was born. It's perfectly straightforward. However, December 25th is not the only date that is proposed in the early church fathers. Other dates include November 18th, January 6th. That was a very popular one. December 25th and January 6th were the two big ones in the early church. Also January 10th, April 19th or 20th, May 20th, and other dates are possible. So when it comes to what day of the year was Jesus born, we can't be certain. But the fact we can't be certain is no reason that we shouldn't use December 25th to commemorate the event. And personally, I plan to. Now let's talk about what year Jesus was born. And if you'll look at this timeline, you'll notice there is no year 0 on it. That's because when this timeline was produced, it was produced in, I want to say the 500s, by a monk in Rome named Dionysius Exiguus. Doesn't that sound like such a cool name, Dionysius Exiguus? It must mean something really cool, right? It means Dennis the Short. But Dennis the Short calculated the year system we now use, and in his day, 0 was not a number. They didn't have it on the number line. And so in his calculations, we went from 1 year before Christ to the first year of Christ, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. And so there's no 0. Remember that, there will be a test. So, what year was Jesus born? Well, a common proposal you hear today is that he was born in 6 or 7 BC. And the argument goes like this. Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. Herod the Great died in 4 BC. The Magi showed up when Jesus was as much as 2 years old. Thank you over there, sir. And therefore, Jesus must have been born around 7 or 6 BC. That's the argument. Problem. Herod the Great didn't die in 4 BC. Better evidence and more recent research indicates that Herod actually died in 1 BC, which is the traditional date. And that agrees with a consensus of the church fathers that Jesus was born in 3/2 BC, meaning the back half of 3 BC or the front half of 2 BC. And there's just a huge consensus among the church fathers. They don't have the BC system, because Dionysius Exiguus hadn't lived yet, but they will say things like, oh yeah, Jesus was born in the 28th year of Augustus. And when you translate that in our terms, it's 3/2 BC. And you know what? You could deduce that from what Luke says. According to Luke, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, the word of God came to John the Baptist. Okay, so that's when John the Baptist's ministry started, 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius began reigning in AD 14. So his first regnal year would have been AD 14 and part of AD 14, part of AD 15. And his 15th year would have been part of AD 29, part of AD 30. Jesus' ministry in Luke's Gospel begins just after John the Baptist, so presumably in the same year. And Luke tells us in the same chapter, Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age. So if you take the year their ministries began, AD 29, and you subtract 30 years, you get 2 BC. You might think it would be 1 BC. Why is it not 1 BC? Because there's no year 0. That's right. So you've got to jump an extra year. And that corresponds, what you can just deduce from Luke chapter 3, corresponds with the consensus of the church fathers indicating Jesus was born in 3 or 2 BC. Therefore, 3 or 2 BC is when Jesus was most likely born. Now let's talk about some mysteries from the Gospels of of Luke and Matthew, which are the 2 Gospels that have infancy narratives. First of all, I mentioned there's a problem with this picture in that it depicts Jesus being born in a barn. Why does it do that? Why is Jesus pictured as being born in a barn? Well, in Luke, as we'll see, it says Mary laid her baby in a manger because there was no room at the inn. So what they're imagining is this. Mary and Joseph rock on up to Motel 6, and they get out of the truck and they go up to the door, and Tom Bodette says, "I'm sorry, but the light we left on for you says no vacancy." And they've got to find emergency alternative accommodations, and the best they can do is a barn. Well, this is unlikely, because what city was Joseph from? Bethlehem. Do you think he had relatives in Bethlehem? Yeah. Who would he logically stay with? Relatives. So he didn't need to go find a motel room. And this is supported by a few other facts that most people don't know. So y'all get to be special because you're about to know them. Here we go. If you read what Luke 2 says, it says that Mary gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. The word in Greek is kataluma. But the thing is, kataluma means more than inn. It means lodging place or lodging. And it can even refer to what we would call a living room. A living room is where the people do their living. They hang out in the living room. And later in the same gospel, in Luke 22, Jesus is talking to Peter and John, and he's arranging for them to find a place where they can celebrate the Last Supper for Passover. And Jesus says, "And you will say to the master of the house, the teacher says to you, 'Where is the guest room?'" But in Greek, it says, "the kataluma." Where's the kataluma where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And Jesus then goes on to tell them that he'll take you to an upper room that's already furnished, and that's where we're going to eat the Passover. So kataluma referred to a room in a house. I mean, yes, it can technically mean inn or any other lodging place, but it refers to a room in a house where the people live. Here's another thing most people don't know. This is what an ancient Israelite house was like. They did have, farm animals, like a lot of people, maybe some people here. They'd have chickens, they'd have sheep, they'd have goats, they'd have cows, but they had little tiny houses where each floor of the house had like a square footage of less than 600 feet. They were tiny, and in cities they were crammed in against each other. They also lived hand to mouth. 90% plus of everybody lived hand to mouth. So they weren't wealthy enough to have big barns. So what they did instead was they had 2 floor houses, technically 3 because of the roof. They entertain up on the roof. But they did most of their living on the 2nd floor, and then you don't want animals around where you're living, so they put the animals on the lowest floor. So the kataluma, the upper room, is where the family would have been hanging out. But because there was no room in the cataluma, no room in the living room, Mary decided to lay her baby in a manger on the lower floor where the animals were kept. So, not in a barn, but on the lower floor of a house. And here's, because you can do a lot better than a barn if you're going to a family where you've got relatives. But there's something else a lot of people don't realize. Israel has lots of caves, and it's a mountainous country, and it has lots of caves. And in cities like Bethlehem and Nazareth, that both have caves, people would build their houses on tops of caves, just like this community I've got pictured here on the left. And so what they do is they have the living area, perhaps above ground, and then the cave below ground. That's where they'd stick the animals. And that's why, if you go to Bethlehem, and I hope you all do, you will notice that the Church of the Nativity is built over a cave. And when you want to commemorate Jesus' birth, you go down into the cave, into what's called the Grotto of the Nativity. And this is not some later thing the Crusaders made up. We have evidence from the 2nd century saying that Jesus was born in a cave. So, that's something to be aware of. Not in a barn, but in an animal keeping area in a cave. Then we move along a little bit. After Mary gives birth, we're told the shepherds were in the region. They were keeping watch over their sheep. And an angel of the Lord stood near them. Ephistemi does mean to stand. It doesn't mean to appear or whatever, at least not normally. Its normal meaning is stand. And the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terribly frightened. The angel tells them about Jesus has been born. And suddenly there was with the angel, so there's just one to start out with, a multitude of the heavenly army praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest." So that's where the image of the angel with the Gloria banner comes from. It's borrowing it from what Luke says happened over in Shepherd's Field. And what you'd actually see would be a little more like the two images on the right, where you've got the one angel in the upper image and the multitude of angels in the lower image. I think those are cool pictures. Unfortunately, they're also not right. Because angels depicted as human beings with wings is not biblical. In the Bible, angels get pictured either as humans without wings, or as composite beings that have elements of different animals. And there you may get wings, but they don't just look like humans with wings. As far as I've been able to determine, that image of winged humanoid angels comes up in Etruscan art prior to the time of the Romans, but we inherited it. In any event, you would have something like one angel appearing to the shepherd, and then suddenly there's a bunch of them there, but they probably didn't have wings, and they were probably standing on the ground. Now let's talk about mysteries in Matthew. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, and there's some stuff wrong with this picture we'll get to. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star at its rising, and we have come to do him homage." Okay, so the first things, now here the Magi are in silhouette, so you can't tell if they're wearing crowns or not. But let me assure you, Magi were not kings. They were a different social class. You can kind of translate the Greek word magos as wise man, because they were known for having special skills, special knowledge. But what the Magi originally were was a priestly tribe among the Medes. The Medes were an ancient Near Eastern people. They had tribal structure, and like Levi is the priestly tribe of the Israelites, the Magi were the priestly tribe of the Medes. And they were known for things like predicting the future and stuff like that. Eventually, though, the term magos broadened to include anybody who did rituals that reminded people of what the Magi did. And so, for example, in the book of Acts, we meet a Jewish guy named Elymas who is described as a Magi, as a Magus, even though he's a Jew, because it could be applied to anybody who did Magi-like rituals. Well, so that's what they are. Where are they from? These Magi came from the east, Matthew tells us. So that tells us they were a Middle Eastern people, but we don't know which one. They could have been Babylonians, which would mean they were from Iraq. They could have been Persians, which would mean they were from Iran. They could have been Arabians. They could have been Nabateans. They could have been somebody else. But we do know they came from the east of Judea. So they're Middle Eastern in origin. Now, if you look at the star in this photo, what's notable about this star? It's got a tail. What do we call a star with a tail? A comet. So it looks kind of like a comet, but I think in this case, what the tail is overhead, and then they sink in the west. So the Magi are in the east. They see the star come up in the east, and that's what tells them a new Jewish king has been born. They didn't say, we've been following the star. They said, we saw it rise. And from that, they inferred that a new Jewish king had been born. So they went to where? Jerusalem. Why would they go there? Because that's where the Jewish king lived. So if you want to find the new baby prince, you would go to where the king lived. So they went to Jerusalem. They didn't go straight to Bethlehem. If the star was leading them around, they would have just gone straight to Bethlehem, and they didn't. They didn't know they needed to go to Bethlehem. They showed up in Jerusalem because it's where the king lives, and then they asked, so where is he? Where they thought he's going to be right here. And Herod consulted with his scribes and so forth and said, actually, Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem. So they then go to Bethlehem. But notice, they got to ask, and they have to be told to go to Bethlehem. They weren't just being led there by the star. And there's another reason, we'll see why that's the case in a minute. But they then head out to Bethlehem. So, what was the star? Well, there have been a bunch of proposals. One of them that is quite common is that it was some kind of supernatural object. You know, basically a UFO. Something that God put in the atmosphere that could lead the Magi around. Because anything that's actually in outer space, you wouldn't have that effect. It needs to be close and low down if you're going to follow it. But the problem is that they weren't following it. So it shouldn't be a supernatural object. They describe it as a star. So it ought to be something that in the first century people would have recognized as a star. And it needs to be a particular kind of star, one that had meaning. Because otherwise they couldn't infer, oh, a Jewish king has been born. There had to be some system of belief that allowed, which otherwise we call it astrology, that enabled them to infer this event has happened because of what we saw with the star. And if God had put a supernatural object in the atmosphere and had them follow it, they wouldn't have recognized its significance. They would need an angel to show up and tell them, hey guys, follow that and you'll find a king. But they don't say anything like that. So the supernatural object theory, since it's based on the idea that they were following the star, and supernatural objects don't have pre-established meanings, that's not a good candidate. What about the idea it was a horoscope? You know, a look at where all the planets are in relation to Jesus' time of birth. Well, there's actually a theory like that that's popular in some circles today. But there are a few problems with it. First one, a horoscope is all of the planets. It's not a single star. More important than that, though, the horoscope that's been proposed is based on Greek astrology. And Greeks live to the west of Israel, not the east. So we don't want to look to Western astrology to try to figure out what the wise men may have seen. We want to look to Eastern astrology, which is different. Also, the horoscope that's been proposed is in the wrong year. It's from 7 BC instead of 3 or 2 BC. So the horoscope theory is not good. What about the idea that what the Magi saw was a shooting star, what we would call a meteor? Well, okay, shooting stars were a kind of star, but the problem is, if you've ever gone shooting star watching, they last for like a second, and then they're out of the sky. And you can't recognize a shooting star from one night to another and say, oh, that's the exact same shooting star I saw a month ago. So we're going to see that the Magi did do that. The star they saw could stay in the sky for hours, and they could recognize it after an extended period. So the shooting star theory is bad. What about the idea it was what they called a long-haired star, or in Greek, an asteres cometes? Well, a long-haired star or comet does stay in the sky for a lengthy period, and you can recognize it from one night to another. Problem: in the ancient world, comets freaked people out. And it was widely regarded that if you saw a comet, it was a sign of disaster that was about to happen. So it would not be plausibly interpreted as, oh great, there's this new Jewish king, let's go pay him homage. Then, well, what about the idea, this is one that was proposed by the astronomer Johannes Kepler in the 1500s. What if it was a new star, or as they say in Latin, a stella nova? The word nova just means new. And periodically in history, new stars have shown up. Well, okay, could be a new star, that's interesting, but the problem is, when a new star shows up, astrologers don't know what it means. They have no experience with it. The way ancient astrology developed, you'd see something happen in the heavens, you'd notice something happened on Earth, and you'd say, okay, next time we see that thing, we're going to predict this same thing on Earth is about to happen again. But if a new star shows up, you don't have any track record of what does it mean. So they wouldn't have interpreted a new star as signaling the birth of a new king. Okay, what if it was one of the background stars? They're also known as fixed stars. These are the stars that always keep the same relative positions next to each other in the sky. They're what make up the constellations, like the stars of the Big Dipper. They're always in the same positions relative to each other. Every 24 hours, they swing around Polaris, the pole star, but other than that, they're always in the same positions. Okay, so the Magi said that they saw Jesus' star when it rose. And sometimes the rising of a fixed star does have meaning. In Egypt, for example, the star Sirius signaled the rising of the Nile, because every year when Sirius came up over the horizon, it was a sign that the Nile was about to flood because of the thaw of the winter snow upstream. So you can have a fixed star that has meaning. The problem is, fixed stars come up every year. Do you think the Magi were expecting a new Jewish king to be born every year? Yeah, probably not. That's an awful lot of Jewish kings. And so, we're really looking for something that would happen in the sky once a generation, not every single year. And that leaves us with another possibility. What if the idea wasn't, what if what they saw wasn't a fixed star, but a wandering star, one that wanders against the background of the fixed stars? Okay, that, in Greek, is those wandering stars are known as asteres planetes. We call them planets, but it just means wandering star. Well, here, this is looking promising. Planets are long-lasting. You can recognize them on different nights. You know, they don't burn out like meteors do. They do move around in ways where some things never happen for a generation. And because they've been around for a long time, they're not new like novas, astrologers have given them meanings. So what was the star that the Magi saw that told them a new Jewish king had been born? It was probably Jupiter. Jupiter is the largest of the planets, and it's often called the king of the planets. It is associated with kings in multiple different cultures. Like the reason we call it Jupiter, that's the Roman name of the king of the gods, also known as Zeus in Greek. In Babylon, since we're not interested in Western astrology, in Babylon they called it Marduk, after the king of their gods. So Jupiter is commonly associated with kings. Also, it's associated with events affecting kings on earth in Babylonian astrology. My favorite example of this is called the substitute king ritual. They had in Babylonian astrology an omen where if you see Jupiter do this in the sky, it means the king of Babylon is about to die. And they took it really seriously. And they thought, well, how if the king, we see Jupiter's just done this, how are we going to protect our beloved king? Well, tell you what we do. Let's go down to the prison and let's get a convict who's already been sentenced to die. And we'll bring him back to the palace and we'll put the royal robes on him. And we will feed him like a king. Everyone's going to refer to him as the king. Meanwhile, the former king, the guy we're protecting, we're going to take him out of the palace. He's going to live in an ordinary house. He's going to dress like a farmer. And everyone in all the court documents will refer to him as the farmer. And so we will then let our king live for a month, our new king. And so we're making it really clear to the gods, this guy here in the palace, he's our new king. That other guy, forget about him, he's just the farmer. And then at the end of the month, we do what was already planned. We execute the king, and then we bring back the farmer. So this is the substitute king ritual. It shows you how seriously the Babylonians took the motions of Jupiter. Well, it so happens that in 3 and 2 BC, Jupiter did several things that were unusual in Babylonian astrology. One of them was it signaled that a new king was going to be born in the west, between where they were in the east and the Mediterranean Sea. And so that area they called Amuru, and it indicated a new king is going to be born in Amuru. The only prominent king in that area was Herod the Great. So they would have inferred a new king has just been born for the dynasty of Herod the Great. And according to what Jupiter was doing in the heavens, it said this new king from Amuru is going to, when he grows up, knock over and end the dynasty in Babylon. Which was actually okay with the Babylonians because they didn't have home rule at the time. They were ruled by the Persians, who they hated. So the idea of, yay, new king is going to come in and rescue us from Persian rule? Let's send a peace embassy to that guy right now to get on his good side. And then later, 9 months later, Jupiter did something else that would have signaled enemy kings will be reconciled and there will be peace. So this could be a very promising sign for the Magi. And that's the best candidate based on actual Eastern astrology, not other stuff, not speculation, not making it up, but actual Eastern astrology. That's a very plausible candidate for what the Magi saw. But I need to mention, there is a documentary out there called The Star of Bethlehem. And I get asked about this constantly. So I'm going to just tell you what I think of it. It's by an evangelical gentleman named Frederick Larson. And he, unlike other documentaries, he uses the correct time frame for when Jesus was born, 3 or 2 BC. And he identifies Jupiter as the star. And he has even identified what Jupiter was doing as what the Magi likely saw. The problem is he just makes up his own explanation for it, for why they would have interpreted it this way. He doesn't know anything about Babylonian astrology, so he just makes up his own explanation for why they would interpret it this way. So if you want to watch this, it's an interesting documentary. He gets a lot right, but his explanation he gets wrong because he's just making it up.
If you want documentation of the explanation I've just given you, you want to check out a book called The Star of Bethlehem and Babylonian Astrology. It's by a Scandinavian researcher named Dag Kilman. He uses the correct time frame, 3 or 2 BC. He has a plausible identification of Jupiter and what it was doing, and he's using actual Babylonian beliefs to form his interpretation of why they did what they did. If you want to go further, you can. You could do what I did and get Babylonian planetary omens, which is a translation of the different cuneiform tablets that we found. And if you want to do that, that's great. I encourage you. Be prepared to pay $300 per volume because it's published by Brill Academic and they charge insane prices. But you can go further. This is actually a grounded theory. So, when the Magi leave Jerusalem and are headed to Bethlehem, Bethlehem is 6 miles south of Jerusalem, and it's also a little bit to the east of Jerusalem. Now, the earth rotates, the sky above us rotates at 15 degrees per hour, 360 divided by 24. 15 degrees per hour, and it takes about 2 hours to get to Bethlehem on foot from Jerusalem. So, it says, after listening to the king, the Magi went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose, that was ages ago, preceded them. So Jupiter is in front of them. And it takes 2 hours to get to Bethlehem, which is south and slightly east to the east of Jerusalem. So Jupiter is going to be in front of them when they start the journey, and it's going to rotate 30 degrees in the 2 hours it takes them to get to Bethlehem. As they go forward and then turn to the east, Jupiter will appear to stay in front of them. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose preceded them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. So they arrive at the house, they look up, Jupiter's right overhead. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. But notice what else it said that I skipped over. When they saw the star, so when did that happen? Beginning or end of their journey? Beginning, right. They see it, they come out, it's night, there's the star. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. You know what that tells us? They weren't expecting to see it necessarily. They weren't following it. If they had been following it, they would, okay, great, there's the star, we can go. They wouldn't have exceeding great joy. But they would have exceeding great joy if they were not following the star and they get told, go to Bethlehem. And so they get on the road to go to Bethlehem, and there's the star again, and it tracks in that 30-degree arc in front of them as they go. That would be because this is a divine sign we're on the right track. And so they would rejoice with great joy upon seeing it. Then after their visit, then Herod, when he saw that he had been deceived by the wise men, became very angry. And he sent soldiers and executed all the children in Bethlehem and in all the region around it from the age of 2 years old and younger, according to the time which he had determined precisely from the Magi. So that's the 2 years thing, which is why we said the Magi weren't there on the night Jesus was born. If he was, Herod would have killed all the newborns. But he didn't. He killed all those 2 years old and younger, which he's probably padded. Just imagine for a moment you're a total homicidal, monomaniacal dictator guy. Okay? Be easier for some of you than others. You want to eliminate a rival to your throne who could challenge you one day to your throne. And you've been told the rival is about this old. You might easily say, let's double that just to be sure. So that 2 years old and under is, I'm guessing it's more like a year, and Herod just doubled it. In any event, that's the explanation for that. But, got to give you all a warning. What this passage shows us, this account with the wise men and the star, it shows us that God can use signs in the sky to signal major phases of his plan for mankind. Like, my son is getting born, here's the birth announcement. God can even use the flawed beliefs of people like Babylonian Magi to help human beings understand part of his plan. But this does not mean that the details of your life are written in the stars. And neither does it mean that human astrologers can accurately interpret those things, even if they were there. So, be careful of astrology. If you want, Weird Al Yankovic has this really great song called That's Your Horoscope for Today. Most of it is ridiculously specific. It's very funny. But my favorite line in it is, the stars predict that tomorrow you'll wake up, do a bunch of stuff, and then go back to sleep. Well, okay, if that's what they're predicting, they're right for all of us, because that's what we all do. In any event, to sum up, Jesus may have been born December 25th, but it could have been another day. He was most likely born in 302 BC. He was likely born in a grotto, not a barn. Shepherds visited the same night. Magi visited up to 2 years later. The star was most likely the wandering star or planet Jupiter. But, like I said at the beginning, you can draw your own conclusions because none of this is church teaching. It's just an attempt to grapple with these mysteries from the perspective of human reason so people can have different opinions. Also, we can still appreciate Christian art, including nativity scenes, that smush all of these events together. So, Merry Christmas, everybody. And now I'm happy to take questions. Given what you've just heard and what you may know about me, I try to treat every question seriously and give a serious answer, so you can be as weird as you want with the question.
I hope it's not too weird.
Yes, ma'am. There's no such thing with me as too weird. Go ahead.
So, perhaps the Magi came 2 years later, so they stayed in Bethlehem 2 years?
So the question is, if the Magi came up to 2 years later, did the Holy Family stay in Bethlehem all that time? This is possible. It is possible that they stayed in Bethlehem for up to 2 years. It is also possible that they went back to Nazareth and then came back down. We have reason to believe that Joseph owned property in Nazareth, and so he probably would have wanted to go back to Nazareth to mind the farm and run his business. Not mind the farm literally, he wasn't a farmer, but to conduct his business and protect their property. And then they would have regularly come back down to Bethlehem, to the Jerusalem area. There were 3 major feasts that you had to, if you were an observant Jew, go to every year in Jerusalem. Passover was one of them, Tabernacles was another. So he and Mary would have trekked down to Jerusalem 3 times a year minimum. And Luke says he also came down for the enrollment that Caesar Augustus had decreed, so he got down to Bethlehem for that as well. Yes, sir.
Put in perspective the presentation in the temple of Christ.
I'm sorry?
The presentation of
The
Christ in the
presentation
temple.
of our Lord in the temple,
Mary brought the baby to the
Simon,
temple.
said, he's great.
Tell you what,
I'm sorry.
But he's going to repeat it.
well, actually, I don't know how to make this work.
I guess put into perspective the presentation of our Lord in the temple, in this timetable, and also the journey to Egypt to escape Herod, how to escape as it relates to all this.
Okay, if I understand correctly, so the presentation of Jesus at the temple occurs shortly after Jesus is born. Not exactly a month, but about a month later. So it's way before the arrival of the Magi. The Magi arrive, I would guess, about a year later. And since Herod, if Jesus is born in 302 BC, then that would mean that the Magi likely arrived at the end of 2 BC, the beginning of 1 BC. Herod died around Easter, or Passover, in 1 BC. And so I think Joseph and Mary went down to Egypt and didn't have to stay there very long before they got word Herod was dead and they could come back. But I'm a fan, like I said, of biblical chronology. I love it. It's a detective story. Additional questions? Yes, sir.
So, when Jesus was born on Christmas, and then we celebrate that, and everybody's happy, so we give everybody gifts. We buy everybody gifts to celebrate that Jesus was born. Raise the tree. So now everybody gets a tree, and we get gifts for everybody, and we wait till the day that Jesus was born and give them to each other as a celebration of Jesus being born. Is that how that happened, the tree and the gifts? Well, we give gifts to each other?
Okay, so if I'm having trouble hearing in distance, but the custom of gift giving, in all likelihood, would have preceded the development of the Christmas tree. Humans naturally give gifts to each other to celebrate things. We see that happening as early as the Old Testament, like in the book of Esther. When the Jewish people get delivered from danger, their first thought is, let's give each other gifts of like food and stuff to celebrate. So people have always given gifts in celebration. The Christmas tree is very recent. It's only shown up in about the last 500 years. And so the custom of putting the gifts under a Christmas tree would have been a fairly recent invention in the history of Christianity. Additional questions? Anybody over here have one? You, sir, and speak loudly for me, please.
Who were the early church fathers who thought it was on January 6th, and they kind of give any reasons as to why?
So the question is, who were the early church fathers that thought Jesus was born on January 6th and why? We don't really have the whys, because everyone who supported a given date, they just thought that's when he was born. They didn't have a why. It's like if I asked you, let's say your birthday was April 8th. If I said, why is your birthday April 8th? Well, you might be able to give a reason for that, but not in a family-friendly circle. But it just is. There's not much of a why beyond that. And so the church fathers don't really offer justifications for why. In terms of who they were, the January 6th theory was more common in the eastern part of Christianity, and the December 25th was more common in the western part of Christianity. I think I saw, yes, sir.
So I've seen explanations for the date, December 25th, and people have tied it to, chronologists have tied it to, where the gospel says that Elizabeth was in her 6th month, and that Zechariah was active in the temple as one of the priests, and putting that together in a time. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's a bad argument. For one reason, so there were, by the 1st century, they had 8,000 priests living in Jerusalem that were qualified to serve not in Jerusalem, but in Israel. They had 8,000 priests. And that was so many that they had way too many priests to serve at any one time. So they had been divided up into 24 different courses of priests, 24 different groups. And each course would get to serve twice a year, 6 months apart. So even if you could calculate when Jesus was born from the timing of John the Baptist's birth, and that of itself is hard because humans aren't born in exactly 6 months. I mean, what that really means is also she's in what we would call the 5th month, because she's completed 5 months. She's in the 6th month. She hasn't yet completed the 6th month. But you'd have to know which of Zechariah's 2 services at the temple each year that are 6 months apart, which one was John the Baptist conceived after, and you'd have to know how long after Zechariah got home that Elizabeth became pregnant, because it presumably wasn't that first night. So there are too many variables here to be able to confidently establish a date. In my opinion, but other people may have other opinions. Yes, ma'am.
So, with all this argument about, or discussion about through the early church, when we were going to celebrate Christmas, when did the church actually set a date and stick by it?
It happened in different places at different times. What happened was it got inserted into liturgical calendar, and it has varied over time. In fact, in some Eastern Christian circles, they still celebrate January 6th.
Right.
So it's really a piecemeal decision that was made in different places by different groups of Christians. Anything else? Yes, sir. Loudly, please.
Yeah, so a question, it sounds like from the astronomical study, we have a sense in 2-3 BC that Jupiter is doing the right things. There's some mention of alignment of the stars in the Bible. And all of the dates for Christ's birth range from January to December, so pretty much all year. Can we use any of the astronomical record to project or narrow down the range of when he was probably born?
They're speculative. So the question is, can we use some of these astronomical considerations to try to determine when in the year Jesus might have been born? The answer is yes, but it's speculative. So I mentioned 9 months apart, Jupiter did stuff on that Babylonian theory that could be connected with a Jewish king. And the earlier of those was in September of 3 BC. And more specifically, it's around September 11th of 3 BC. Now, that's speculation, because among other things, it assumes we've correctly understood what the Babylonians were thinking. But there's some potential confirmation in the Bible itself. In Revelation 12, John sees the sign of a great sign of a woman in heaven. So he sees this big woman in heaven, and she's got the sun in her midst and the moon at her feet, and she's got a crown of 12 stars, and she gives birth to the Messiah. Okay, on one level, this is obviously Mary. But he sees this sign in the sky. Mary is a virgin. Is there a virgin in the sky? Virgo. Is there then a time of year when the sun is in the middle of Virgo and the moon is at the feet of Virgo? Yes, there is. And there have been people who know nothing about Babylonian astrology who have looked at Revelation 12 and said, this may preserve information about when Jesus was born. And because this is the sign of his birth in the heavens in Revelation. And it would, if that interpretation is correct, point to September 11th, 3 BC.
Thank you.
But it's speculative. Don't want to oversell it. Any other additional questions? Father Monique? Oh, okay. I thought that was a good question. Okay. Yes, sir.
You said that Jupiter did 3 different things. What were those things that Jupiter did?
One of them, the third one, was it arrived at what's called its halting point. One of the things that certain planets will do is they'll move across the sky, and then they'll stop, and then they'll move backwards, and then they'll stop again and move forwards. And that happens because of the orbits of the planets. It's like on a freeway. You know, a car may be passing you, but then you catch up with them, and it looks like they've stopped, and then it looks like they start going backwards as you pass them. But then they get mad that you passed them, they put their foot on the brake and they go forward and pass you. Well, it's like that with the planets. And when the planet gets to one of those points where it seems to stop, that's called its halting point. And in the second of the two major things that Jupiter did, it reached its halting point, and that was what was associated with enemy kings becoming reconciled. When it comes to the others, it's more complicated. It involves also what Saturn was doing and what the background stars were, and I want to go recheck rather than misspeak. But it did stuff that was interpreted as King of Amuru is going to knock over the Babylonian dynasty and you can make friends maybe. Okay, we've been going for a while and it seems to be getting a little more chill in here. Last question, anybody? Okay, well, yes, sir.
Can we have you come back again and teach us more stuff?
Oh, sure. Anytime Father Jason would want me to come back and talk about more stuff, I'm happy to do it.
Excellent.
So, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I hope you found it interesting. Like I said, have your own opinions, but I hope this was interesting to think about. And don't nitpick the parish nativity scene. And Merry Christmas, everybody.